The morning of my wife's funeral, I wore a gray tie instead of black. Everyone noticed. Nobody said anything. I stood at the front of that room, shook hands I didn't want to shake, accepted condolences I didn't deserve to receive, and smiled the way men smile when they know something the room doesn't. My wife wasn't in that casket, and I had spent the last 11 days making sure no one would find out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Her name was Diane. We met when I was 29 and arrogant in the way that only men who have just built their first successful business can be, certain that the hard part was over, that everything from here was just upward motion. She was at a client dinner I wasn't supposed to attend. My business partner had canceled last minute, and I took his seat because I didn't want the evening to go to waste. She was across the table, working in commercial property, and she laughed at something I said that wasn't particularly funny. I remember thinking, this woman is being kind on purpose. I didn't know then how accurately that described everything she would do to me for the next 9 years. We were married at 31. By 34, the business had scaled beyond what either of us had projected. I was running 3 commercial contracts simultaneously. My company had 15 full-time employees and 2 satellite offices, and Diane had quietly moved from her own career into managing our personal finances, our property portfolio, and the administrative backbone of my company. It wasn't a conversation we had planned. It happened the way most catastrophic arrangements happen, gradually, reasonably, one small step at a time. She handled the accounts because she understood property, and I didn't want. She handled the tax filings because I was always traveling. She handled the investment accounts because she had the time, and I trusted her completely. That's the part one replay most, not the betrayal itself. The trust, the absolute, unquestioning, architectural trust one had built my entire life around, and placed entirely in one person. But that wasn't the worst part. The first sign wasn't a sign I recognized as one. About 2 years before everything collapsed, Diane started talking about her mother, Margaret, a woman I had met perhaps 30 times in 9 years and liked genuinely. Quiet, measured, proud in a particular way of women who raised children alone. Diane began mentioning her more, worrying about her health, suggesting we help out financially. I agreed without examining the suggestion closely because it was reasonable and because I was in the middle of a difficult period with one of my larger clients. We set up a monthly transfer for £1,000 directly into Margaret's account. For living expenses, Diane said, for peace of mind. I nodded. I signed what I needed to sign. I moved on. 12 months later, the monthly transfer had become $6,000, then $8,000, then a lump sum gift of $40,000 for what Diane described as urgent repairs on Margaret's house. I reviewed none of it. I was busy. I was always busy. I had built a machine that required constant tending, and I had handed the oil can to my wife, and I trusted her to keep everything running while I kept building. What I didn't know was that Margaret's house had no urgent repairs. What I didn't know was that Margaret's account had become a reservoir, a collection point for funds that were being slowly, methodically, expertly moved out of our joint assets and into a structure I had no visibility into. What I didn't know was that for at least 2 years, possibly longer, my wife had been preparing to leave. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, surgically, with the same measured kindness I had mistaken at that dinner table 9 years earlier for something genuine. She had learned from the best. She had watched me build a business from nothing by being calm, strategic, and patient. She had applied every lesson. What he said next changed everything. His name was Colin. He was my accountant for 7 years, a careful man who wore the same style of glasses his entire adult life, and kept files with a precision that bordered on devotion. He called me on a Tuesday afternoon in February, 3 years ago now, and asked if I had a moment to go over something he had noticed. I said yes. I was in the car. I pulled over. He spoke slowly, the way people speak when they are delivering news they have rehearsed. He had been reviewing my personal portfolio ahead of year-end filings. There were discrepancies, not large ones, not the kind that announce themselves. Small ones, quiet ones, the kind that only appear when someone who knows what they're looking for goes looking. Funds transferred to third-party accounts he didn't recognize. Property investments made in my name that I had never approved. A holding company registered 18 months prior, registered in my name, with an address I didn't recognize, with Diane listed as sole director. I sat in that car for a long time after he finished. The sky outside was the flat, gray color of a February afternoon that has decided not to commit to anything. A woman walked past with a dog on a lead. The dog stopped and looked at my car. The woman pulled it along. The whole world kept moving and I sat completely still, because I understood, not partially, not suspiciously, but completely, with the cold clarity of a man who has just watched the architecture of his life invert, that my wife had been building something in the dark, something that ran parallel to our marriage, something that was designed to outlast it. I didn't call Diane. I called my solicitor. And then I started to understand the scale of it. Over the following 3 weeks, working with Colin and a forensic accountant he recommended, I began to map what Diane had done. It was, in its own terrible way, impressive. She hadn't stolen in the way people imagine theft, violently, recklessly, in large amounts that trigger alarms. She had moved money the way water moves, finding the lowest point, following the path of least resistance, accumulating slowly and silently until the volume became something that could reshape the landscape. The total, when we finally had a clear picture, was just over 430,000 pounds, moved across a period of approximately 31 months, into 3 accounts, 2 in her mother's name, 1 in the name of the holding company. The holding company itself owned 2 properties, both purchased using funds redirected from our joint investment account, both titled in a way that would make them extraordinarily difficult to recover in a standard divorce proceeding. She had also, 6 months prior, quietly increased the life insurance policy we held jointly. The beneficiary on her side had been amended. It no longer pointed to me. When I saw that detail, I understood that this wasn't just financial planning. This was an exit, a total, complete, carefully orchestrated exit from our marriage, from our shared life, from everything we had built together. And she had been executing with a smile on her face every single morning at our kitchen table. She thought the pain was over. She was wrong. Here is where I have to be honest about something. In the weeks after I understood what Diane had done, I felt something I didn't expect. Not rage. I had anticipated rage. Had braced for it the way you brace for a wave. But rage didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and far more dangerous. A kind of cold, settled clarity. The feeling of a man who had been operating in fog for years and has suddenly, at great cost, found himself in clear air. I had built a business from the ground up. I had negotiated contracts with people who wanted to take everything I had and leave me with nothing. I had survived a period early in my 30s when I thought the whole enterprise was going to collapse, when I had to sit across the table from people I owed money to and convince them, without any certainty of my own, that I was worth backing. I knew how to sit still. I knew how to wait. I knew how to smile at people who were planning to hurt me and give them absolutely no indication that I could see what they were doing. I called my solicitor again. I told him I didn't want to confront Diane yet. I told him I wanted 30 days. He paused. He asked me what I intended to do with 30 days. I told him I intended to let her think she was winning. Then the phone rang. It was Diane's mother, Margaret. I had expected this moment to feel confrontational. It didn't. Margaret's voice on the phone was careful. The voice of a woman who is doing something her conscience hasn't fully agreed to. She wanted me to know, she said, that she had been told the transfers were legitimate, that Diane had told her they were investment returns, her share of a business restructure, money that legally belonged to her, and was simply being held safely until things were finalized. Margaret didn't know she was describing the mechanism of her own daughter's fraud. I asked her gently whether Diane had mentioned the timeline. When things were going to be finalized, there was a pause on the line. Then Margaret said, "She told me you were ill. She told me you had been diagnosed. She said she was protecting herself. She said she needed the money out before." And then she stopped, and in the silence that followed, I understood the final piece. Diane had told her mother I was dying, not leaving, not planning to divorce. Dying, a terminal diagnosis. She had built a story around my fictional death to justify the movement of money to a woman who would have otherwise asked too many questions. She had used her own mother as an instrument, had handed her a false narrative about a dying husband, and allowed her to carry it without knowing what she was carrying. I stayed on the phone with Margaret for 40 minutes. By the end of it, she was crying. By the end of it, she had agreed to cooperate fully with my solicitor. By the end of it, I had an idea.